All right, so we've been talking about politics and the way that political sociologists or sociologists who study politics go about understanding how politics works. Now, a central concept in making sense of politics and how politics plays out is the concept of power, and as we'll see in a few minutes, the associated concept of authority. In order to understand politics, we have to understand power. In some sense, politics is all about power. It's about the distribution of power in societies. And it's about the question of who gets control over power and who gets to tell others what they can and cannot do within societies. And so let's dive into figuring out what power then is all about. Now, the core starting point for most, if not all, sociologists in understanding power is this guy, Max Weber. He's a sociologist really from the 19th century. He passed away in 1920 or so. And he gives us a really important way to make sense of power. So Max Weber, the way to say his name is Max Weber, not Weber, but Weber. Weber gives us a way to think about power. He defines power as the ability to get others to do what you want them to do, even if they resist. So even against their resistance. So you know that someone has power when they have the capacity to make other people do what's in their interests, what they want to do, what they think other people should do. And they can do this even when those people try to stop them. That's when you know someone has power. Now that's going to be for us a starting place for understanding power, because it turns out there's a lot more to power than this sort of raw, what we'll come to call coercive power. But it's a really important way to start off. Now in this context, let's think about a fairly famous set of experiments that happened in the 1960s. So this is Stanley Milgram. Now that we understand a little bit about power, we're going to flesh this out and really provide some greater detail and important theoretical understanding to the concept with the Milgram experiment. So what were the Milgram experiments? Well, in the 1960s, this psychologist, right, that you see here, Stanley Milgram, decided to bring in a set of people from the local community. He was at Yale University, so these are people coming in from New Haven, and he offered them money in exchange for their time participating in an experiment, much as experiments today tend to be conducted. And so what he had them do was he had them come into the laboratory, and they would first encounter this guy here that you see standing up, Mr. Williams, who's going to be the experimenter, the face of the experiment for these individuals. They sit down, and Mr. Williams brings them a hat, and they pull out of the hat one of two social roles, either a teacher or a learner. Now, an important part of this experiment is that only one of these individuals, in fact, is a participant. The other is what we call a confederate. And a confederate is someone who is in on the experiment. They appear to be participating in the experiment, but they're really a part of the experiment itself. And the learner is going to be, is in fact a confederate in this experiment. So ultimately the confederate pulls out a piece of paper out of the hat, and it says on it learner, so that means he's going to be the learner and the other person is going to be the teacher. So they separate ways, and the learner goes in, or excuse me, the teacher goes in with Mr. Williams into a room that looks something like this. So he sits down at a table, and at that table he has in front of him all of these controls. And these are little switches, and on these switches is voltage. And so it's going to be the case that he's going to be able to flip these switches when he's told to, and to provide a shock, an electric shock to the learner. So the teacher is given a set of paired words together. He's going to read that list of paired words, and then the learner is going to recite back the second word in each of those word pairs. Now, when the learner does this incorrectly, that's when the teacher is going to then shock them with the volt. Now, let's take a moment here. There are no actual electrical shocks happening. Again, the learner is the confederate, so he's in on the experiment. But the teacher thinks that every time the learner gets an incorrect answer, that he's going, when he presses that button, that the learner is in fact getting a real shock. And so they have tape recorded responses to this of groans and yells and concerns actually coming from the learner. That the teacher is going to be able to hear every time they administer the shock. Right? So they're going to go through these word pairs. The learner is going to say many of them wrong, and every time he says one wrong, then he is going to get a voltage, and apparently going to get a voltage shock. And the real question for Milgram here is, how far are these teachers willing to go? Just how far are they willing to go in the experiment? And it's pretty extraordinary, because it turns out that almost almost 2/3 of them go all the way to the very end, administering what they think is about 450 volts of electricity into the learner for getting these questions wrong. And really, it's important to see here that this is not a sort of unique or sort of unexpected finding. Well, it may be unexpected, but it's not a unique finding. That is, this particular finding has been replicated in many studies since the Milgram experiment. Now, this raises a really important question, because when you watch, and you can actually, I encourage you to go to YouTube and see if you can find clips of this, when you actually watch these take place, it's very clear that the teacher expresses discomfort and is uncomfortable with what is happening. They don't want to administer the shocks. They're not psychotic. They're not happily administering these shocks. They're not even sort of blindly administering these shocks. They express real discomfort, real concern and consternation about this. They're uncomfortable with what it is they're actually doing. So why do these people continue to inflict pain even as they're experiencing this discomfort? Why do they go all the way to the end? And this is where the concept of power becomes really important here, and we can really develop some nuance in making sense of this. So let's actually separate out then two forms of power. One is that coercive power, when someone is told they're going to do something, and then just by sheer brute force, the other person can force them into doing it. So that's one form of power to think about it, and that's what Weber gives us in the beginning. We can think about that as power as coercion. But what's really happening in this experiment is the role of authority, or what Weber calls legitimate power. Because remember, in that room, sitting with the teacher is an authority figure, a man in a lab coat who is the experimenter. And regularly throughout the experiment, they would turn to the experimenter, Mr. Williams, and say, do I have to go on here? Do I have to administer these shocks? Can't we just go ahead and stop the experiment? I don't want to do this anymore. I want to stop the experiment. And continually, Mr. Williams says, the experiment must go on. You have to administer the shocks. And that's when they do it. They do it when they believe that there is an authority figure who is telling them that they have to go on. That is, they believe that this person has a form of legitimate power over them. Now, in the experiment, they could, in fact, leave at any time. If they could have just stood up and walked out and gone on home. But they don't, because they believe the experimenter has this authority to compel them to continue forward. And that's what authority is all about. It's power that the subordinate, the person who's being dominated, perceives to be justifiable. They perceive the person in the position of authority to have the right to tell them what to do, and that their obligation is to go forward with that, with those orders. So authority in that sense works because we allow it to work. That is, the dominated group, the subordinate actors, the subordinate individuals, allow it to go forward. We come to believe that there are people who can tell us what to do. This is really what socialization into childhood is all about, right? Children coming to learn that parents have authority, and they have the power to tell them what to do, and they have to comply with it. This is what your employment relationship looks like. We believe that a person called our manager, our employer, has the right to tell us when to show up to work, and that if we refuse to comply, they're within their rights to no longer allow us to work there. We come to accept that as a legitimate form of power over us. So in this context then, Mr. Williams didn't have to force them to stay in the chair. Mr. Williams did not have to coerce them into doing anything because they believed Mr. Williams had the authority to tell them what to do. Now this raises, I think, what is the most important question for us to get into at the very end here, and that I want us to have a really good conversation about, which is what are the conditions under which people resist authority? And one of the cool things about experiments is that you can replicate them over time, and you can then change things about the experiment, about the conditions, about the experimental condition to see if people are more or less likely to resist authority under these different conditions. So when, we might say, are people more likely to resist Mr. Williams? Well, in replications, we see that fewer continue the experiment when the experimenter is not in the room. So in one condition, they had Mr. Williams in another room, and they would call Mr. Williams on the phone to say that they were to ask those same questions. Do I have to keep going? Do I have to press this button? Mr. Williams over the phone would say yes, but we find that fewer are likely to continue and actually press those voltage, those shocks, when Mr. Williams is not sitting next to them. So when that form of authority is not actually directly looking at you and overseeing you. They also are less likely to continue when they can see the learner, when they can see a person who is being shocked. So they actually hired real actors to act as if they were being shocked in the other room, and people are much less likely to go forward if they have this sort of emotional connection where they can physically see that they're doing harm to the other person. And they're also less likely to go forward if they have another person in the room who's administering shocks with them, who refuses to go forward. So when the other person says, when another person says, no, I'm not going to continue, and this would be, again, a confederate, says, I'm not going to continue with this experiment, then those teachers are less likely to go forward. So if you think about that, people are more likely to resist authority when they think the authority figure cannot enforce those orders. When they have some emotional attachment, they see the other person, the humanity of the other person that they're inflicting pain or harm onto, and they're more likely to resist. They're less likely to continue and just follow those orders when others around them resist, right? Think about that as within our social networks. When we see other people in our social network resisting, then we become more likely to resist. Okay, so that's all for now. This gives us a way to think a little bit about power, understand the difference between power and authority, and really come to recognize the role that authority plays in domination and in the way that other people exert power over us. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon.